So the first question is, in Russia, in connection with the war in Ukraine, those who consider themselves Marxist dispute a lot about which countries can we call imperialist. Some argue that Russia is an imperialist country and it is at war with the United States over Ukraine's resources. That is, we are in the imperialist war, where each side acts as a predator, and Ukraine turns out to be a victim. Could you please comment on the issue?
Sure. I think there's several aspects to that question. In terms of Ukraine, maybe we'll come on to the question of Ukraine's sovereignty a little bit afterwards. But just simply looking at Russia, to characterize it as imperialist, you would have to show that its economy is dominated by monopoly finance capital, which has outgrown its borders and which is essentially serving markets abroad by exporting capital, investing in investment in production abroad, making super profits from that investment and bringing those super profits back home. And essentially that Russian economy and Russian society was living like a parasite on the world. Yes, that Russian economy was less and less productive at home because it was outsourcing its production to cheap countries abroad. That's the kind of core essence of an imperialist economy, is that it's domination by a financial oligarchy, which has grown up out of capitalist development. There's a lot of confusion about Russian monopolies because the monopolies that Russia has today are not the product of a historical development of capitalism in Russia. They've been taken over by capitalists to run for profit, but they are the development of Soviet building, the construction of a planned economy. So, of course, a planned state economy builds monopolies. Right? You don't have competition in a planned economy. So, of course, the capitalists who took over running Russia after the counter-revolution, they are running what were formerly state monopolies for profit. What's quite interesting when you look at Russia today is, in order to face the aggression of imperialism, Western imperialism, what have the Russians done to their economy to strengthen it? They've started taking back into control elements of the economy which are needed for reliance, self-reliance, independence, for a strong response to imperialism, to be able to stand up to imperialist economic aggression. They are starting to renationalize key sectors of the economy, or to give a lot of state funding and direction to key sectors of the economy, right? Like agriculture, which had been kind of destroyed after the Soviet Union to a great extent compared to what it was. Yes, so there's that aspect. You simply cannot look at the Russian economy and say it lives by leeching from the productive activity of workers elsewhere in the world. Russia's main trade with the rest of the world, main financial interaction with the rest of the world, is not the export of capital in order to bring back super profits. It's the sale of Russian commodities, which Russian workers extract and produce, right? So it's simply not right to characterize Russia's economy as imperialist. Being a big country is not proof of being imperialist. This is very much a kind of it's how the imperialists have twisted our understanding of imperialism. They take advantage of the fact that most of us don't actually study Lenin, don't really know what imperialism is. They take advantage of the fact that the masses in the world have learned to hate imperialism. And they point to countries which are big territorially and beginning to be strong economically and able to resist them. And they say, look, they're big. They've got a big military, that means they're aggressive, that means they're imperialist. But this is a total vulgarization, really. Of course, being big has nothing to do with anything. In fact, the imperialist countries, apart from the USA, tended to be quite small, but they were politically and financially advanced, technologically advanced, and able to conquer vast backward territories in the world and enslave their people and loot their resources. That was the essence of the imperialist system that was set up by the Europeans. The Americans slightly confused our understanding of that because, of course, they're a bigger territory with a bigger population and a bigger kind of ability to produce you know, simply by means of the size of their territory and their people. They're a big country. So we've come to view a big country with a big military as inherently bad and aggressive because of how we perceive the United States of America. But Russia has a big military, again, not because it's come out of a historic drive to conquer the world, but because it's the legacy of the Soviet Union. Why did the Soviet Union need a big, strong, technically advanced military? For self-defense. Because socialist countries in an imperialist world cannot survive for one day if they can't defend themselves. And that means they have to keep up and even go past the technological and military capabilities of the imperialists. It's the only way to survive. That has been shown very clearly by history of the last, 110 years. Same when we look at China. China was dominated and enslaved, by imperialism. And the same thing, in the course of their revolution of freeing themselves from imperialism, they have built a big, strong, technically advanced military. Having a big military is not proof you're an imperialist. It's what you do with it. What's the function of your military? Is it defensive or offensive? When we look at the USA, we see its bases all over the world. We see, for example, its bases ringing Russia. Just that on its own shows you the intent of the USA towards Russia. It's not an accident they put their bases all around the outside of Russia. It's not an accident that they provoke regime change operations in every country bordering Russia, trying to create a hostile and unstable environment, trying to bring factors into play that will act inside Russia to bring about regime change. Now, with Ukraine has for 100 years and more been a target of various imperialist powers. Britain, Germany, and the USA at different times took the lead in trying to use a section of the Ukrainian population to turn Ukraine's territory into a launching pad for aggression against Russia. The desire to destroy the Soviet Union and then Russia, to break it into pieces, loot its resources, and essentially colonize it, has been a long-held desire of the imperialist countries, and Ukraine was always seen as a key part of that. And if we look at the launch of the SMO, the Special Military Operation by Russia in 2022, many people in Russia who were paying attention felt that that was a very late, belated move to come to the rescue of the people in the Donbass. The war didn't start in February 22. I'm sure I don't need to tell that to your viewers. The war began with the coup in 2013-14 in Kiev. That was when Ukraine lost its sovereignty. If Ukrainians want to regain their sovereignty, it's the USA they need to be fighting, not Russia. Russia came to defend Ukrainians who were standing up for their sovereignty, or people in the Russian part of Ukraine who were standing up for sovereignty for themselves against a fascist West-backed coup regime and everything that brought with it.
I absolutely agree with you. And how do you feel about the concept of sub-imperialism? It's like the pyramid of imperialism, according to which almost all countries are imperialist countries.
Well, again, it makes a nonsense out of real Marxism. What it does is try to create a formula by which, when I was in school, I remember having a maths teacher who taught me that there is a way where you can make 1.99 equal 2, and by doing that, actually, you can make 1 equal 2. There's a logical thing that it's like a trick, okay? But it's a trick. It doesn't make 1 equal 2. Just because I can show you in a logical sequence how to make 1 equal 2. Is 1 now 2? Of course it isn't. Now, this thing with this theory of the pyramid, what it does is it takes some true things and then it kind of plays a trick and says, if this is true and this is true, then this must be true. But it doesn't prove it. It kind of says, okay, Lenin said we're now in the era of imperialism. Yep, true. Lenin said that capitalism develops into monopoly. True, right? Therefore, all capitalism today is monopoly capitalism. Not true. Now, they've done that, this plus this equals this. They haven't given any data that shows that this is true. They just say it. And the thing is that will work with people who want to go along with the conclusions. Because having said this, they then go to a bunch of people and say, Russia's imperialist, you know, China's imperialist, you know, Brazil, India. Well, there are certain people who find those conclusions very comfortable. In particular, communists in the Western world. Because if Russia's imperialist, then we don't have to fight against our own imperialists' war drive, because it's all justified, or at the very least, we're neutral. Oh, they're as bad as each other. This has nothing to do with me. Don't worry, you workers. Nothing for you to do here. Stay at home. We don't have to mobilize you and have the difficult job of facing our own ruling class, which is going to come down on us, right? So you can see there are reasons why people find this theory comfortable and comforting, just so long as they don't think too hard about it.
So what about China? The China isn't an imperialist country, right?
No, not at all. As I was saying before, you know, you can absolutely not make the argument that China is living as a parasite off the rest of the world. It's quite clearly the opposite. It's Chinese workers who are making goods for the rest of the world, certainly for the West. You know, Western economies are living like parasites from China. Look in the West now. You know, it's more than 100 years since Lenin wrote his book on imperialism. When he was writing, he pointed to little areas in the West which had become totally parasitic, where nobody did anything at all that was productive, like in certain counties in England or in the south of France or in Switzerland. He pointed to little places and he said, look at this trend, how it's developing. Now today, living in Britain, you are hard put to find almost anybody doing anything productive. But of course, I'm still writing with pens on pieces of paper. I'm standing at my desk. I'm using this computer. I'm drinking my cup of tea out of a cup, right? All day, every day, I'm using products that somebody made. So if the people in Britain aren't making them, someone somewhere's making them, right? And this shows you the relationship of the British economy to economies in the rest of the world. The same thing, you know, we look at the size of our economy. Why is it that a tiny country like Britain, tiny country with a tiny population and insignificant territory, insignificant resources, is in the 6th or 7th largest economies of the world? Largest economies. What does it mean? We don't make anything. We don't have anything. We're not exporting anything to the world. What is it? It's because we are this historic home to a huge pile of capital, which constantly goes abroad to expand itself and repatriates the profit, the wealth, sucks the wealth from the world. And we increasingly, even the poor in our country, live as parasites on the wealth that's produced elsewhere in the world. You cannot possibly make that argument that that's what China does, that that's how China's economy works. Nor can you say that they are going around the world coercing militarily anybody, you know, into some kind of enslaved dependent relationship. You know, none of that stands up to any scrutiny. It's simply an assertion that the ruling class uses, and many people in the kind of fake left parrot it because it's easy. It's much easier if you live in the West and you want to be a bit progressive to agree that, you know, China is imperialist and that's why we don't support it, rather than have to stand up against your own ruling class.
In Russia, it's often said that the Chinese policy in Africa is a sign of imperialism. Do you agree with it?
Well, you know, I've spoken to many Africans about this, and their experience is quite the reverse. You know, I remember speaking to an ambassador who had been a liberation fighter from Zimbabwe. And he talked to me, this was during the period of the land reform in Zimbabwe, when British imperialism was going crazy and making a lot of propaganda against the Zimbabwean government, because they said, we're going to take our land back. And we're tired of waiting for you British to facilitate this process, which you promised to do 30 years ago and still haven't done. Right? So they were going through a land reform process. And there was a lot of, they basically had to sever their relationship with the IMF. So they'd had a period after liberation where they did all the things that respectable regimes are supposed to do, right? And they took loans from the IMF to help with their development. And this ambassador said to me, you know, when the IMF came, we got a big loan, but after the money was spent, what we had was a lot of reports from a lot of consultants about how we might electrify the country. But we had no electricity and a big debt. He said, when we broke that relationship with the IMF, we discovered that electrification is not that hard. You need poles, you need wires, you need workers to put them up. But, essentially, this relationship with the West, where they give you loans, Lenin even described it actually in Imperialism. It's the same process. They give you loans, but the loans have conditions that you actually have to spend the loan with companies from the country that loaned you the money. So in the end, you've got a big debt to service. All your money has been spent enriching the country that lent you the money in the first place. You're just there paying interest forever. You get nothing out of it. The Chinese relationship with Africa is totally different. If they make a loan, the interest rates are very low. Very often, they scrap big parts of their loans if a country turns out it can't really pay it. They're not interested in sucking the wealth out of countries. They're interested in helping them develop. They transfer technology. They don't hold on to technology and charge the world a premium for access to it. They share technology, they transfer it. They say, oh, we have some new methods of growing crops in this type of environment. You might benefit from that. Why don't you try it? They'll say, oh, we can build a railway line for you. And they really do it. It's not like they promise to do it and you pay and get nothing. If the Chinese say, we'll build you a port, we'll build you a railway line, we'll build you a highway, guess what? Or a hospital or a school or a university, you get it quickly, and your country starts to change. So the experience of people of living in countries where China has helped with development investment is things are changing and developing for the better.
How do you see the future of China? How likely is it to build socialism there? Is it a socialist country in your view or not?
Well, it's a kind of a strange hybrid, I would say. My father, I'm not the expert on China, but my father has done a lot of work on China and the Chinese economy. He wrote a very excellent book. Hang on, let me see if I've got a copy.
Could you share the link with me?
Yes, I will do, but I'll just show you the book anyway. It's called Socialism with Chinese Characteristics: The Marketization of the Chinese Economy. Well, you'll get from the title there that his researches drew him to the conclusion that to a large extent China's economy has been marketized, that the planned economy is no longer the model of the Chinese state, and that this is something worrying and problematic for China, because as soon as you bring back the market, and especially when it has so much sway over so many areas, important areas of production and social life, you are bringing back inequality, unemployment, corruption, crisis, overproduction. All these things come with capitalism. And the interesting situation that China's in is there hasn't been a coup politically. So the Communist Party is still in power. The Communist Party still bases itself very much in the masses, has very strong connections with the masses, does everything it can to mitigate the worst effects of the market on the people. It's our view that a proper planned economy would be much stronger and more resilient, and then you wouldn't have to be constantly mitigating the effects of the market. But for now, that's the model that China's taken. My view is, and my party's view is, that in the end, this model has to give. There's no way to get to full socialism, and certainly not onto communism, without abolishing the market. So either the market forces will create a bourgeoisie that's strong enough to seize political power, and you will have a counter-revolution, which is what happened in the Soviet Union. Market forces led to the strengthening of political forces, which eventually were able to make a coup, and you had the restoration of capitalism. Or the market will be once more eliminated from the economy, and they'll be able to go into socialism. Right now, you can see either of those things happening, and I would not like to predict. Of course, I know which I hope very much happens. And the reason that we criticize the path that China's on in a comradely way is because we want the Chinese revolution to be saved. We want the Chinese people to go forward to socialism. We would not wish on the Chinese people what happened to the Soviet people. It's a tragedy not just for them, but for the whole world. We all know what the world lost with the Soviet Union. Stalin said, he predicted, if the land of the Soviets is lost, the workers of the world will be seized by the throat. That was what he said in an interview, I think back in the 1930s. And it's exactly true. In the 1990s, the workers of the world were seized by the throat. And we have lost so much with the Soviet Union, and we don't need another setback like that. And especially right now, we don't need it when we consider that the imperialist world is really on the rocks. They are weaker than they have ever been internally, economically, politically, militarily. They're being outmaneuvered in so many ways and outflanked by the rising kind of anti-imperialist world. So my hope is very much that the conditions of having to face down the imperialists and the realization of what capitalism really looks like by looking at these enemies that are flocking around, Russia and China and trying to destroy them, will strengthen the social forces that want to keep China to the socialist path.
Tell you more, when I read books about China, the publications, some articles, I see that there are 5-year plans, that they have not only economic development, but also social development. I mean, like 800 million people was just bring from the poverty.
Yes, for sure. But for example, now I don't like to denigrate, its wonderful achievements of the Chinese party, and it shows how serious and sincere they are about wanting to help the people. But the fact is their economics are confused. And there's a logic to that can't be escaped. Now, the truth is, when Deng Xiaoping was not a great socialist, he was a capitalist roader. And he undermined, some of the great strides that had been made for the Chinese people. Yes, they unleashed all kinds of forces that were able to, make a lot of money quickly and develop industry very fast. But it was all done on the basis of what the Chinese people had already done. It wasn't like, oh, capitalism's so clever. It was like, we've built an industrial base and now capitalists get to profit from it. The people had already done the hardest part, in fact, by the time Deng Xiaoping took over from Mao Zedong in, I think, 79, maybe. In terms of lifting people out of poverty, the revolution did that in a far more impressive way, in the sense that the people in 1949 were in absolutely abject poverty. And by 1979, their life expectancy had doubled and nobody was hungry. Now, after Deng Xiaoping, the iron rice bowl, they called it, the guarantee that everybody has food, the guarantee everyone has a job, the guarantee everyone has a home, even if it's really basic, and everyone has education, and everyone has healthcare. And yes, it was really, really basic. It wasn't modern, it wasn't advanced, but it was for everybody. That was broken. And China is still trying to catch up, in some ways, back to where it was. Now, yes, of course, for many people, the standard of living is exponentially higher than it was then, but it's been very unequal. There's billionaires in China, and there are people still living in, relative poverty. Now, the Chinese government says it wants to abandon that and abolish that, and I'm sure they'll do what they can. But there's big problems. They have unemployment. A socialist society, what's it doing with unemployed people? They have not just this rampant inequality, which of course is insane. You don't have billionaires in a proper planned economy, but there are people paying for people have to pay for their education. People have to pay for hospital treatment, and they've got to, they help, the government subsidizes that and tries to make sure it's not too much. But it's a very labyrinthine and slightly ridiculous system, all because some of the healthcare providers are making money. None of this fits with building, just trying to build a socialist economy. And it causes all kinds of problems in social life. They are generating the basis for a counter-revolution simply with their economics. They're creating a bourgeois class which has an interest in reverting to capitalism so it can have unrestrained, looting on the market. And those people will ally themselves with the West, and even the ones who don't ally with the West will ally against socialism. So, the more of that you allow, the more problems you create. I know till now, the Chinese government has done an extremely good job of balancing all these problems. But that doesn't mean they found a recipe that's going to work forever. the contradictions will continue to grow, and there's no way out of that. You just have to study Marx to understand that. You have to read Capital to understand it. There's no magic way to run capital. There's no magic way to exploit the working class without creating all of the problems of a capitalist society.
And the question tightly linked with the theme of imperialism is fascism. Do I understand right that you rely on Dimitrov's definition of fascism?
Yes, for sure. So it's our understanding that fascism is basically the naked dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in a time of crisis. So at home in the imperialist countries, we're talking about the abolition of bourgeois democracy and its replacement by the naked fist, the naked dictatorship. But there's something else as well, which I think can confuse the matter, which is that fascistic methods have always been exported by the imperialist ruling classes abroad. There, they have always ruled with the iron fist and not the velvet glove, right, in their colonies. And increasingly around the world today, and I think in fact it's a sign, if you like, of the weakness of imperialism. It doesn't feel able to conduct its wars abroad, its expeditionary wars of conquest, right? Say in Ukraine or in Syria or wherever in Palestine, directly with its own soldiers.
Because it was my next question about the fascism for export.
Right. So its people would not be happy to go and be part of the war machine in missions which are obviously aggressive and for territorial conquest. So the imperialists are in a situation where they have to use proxy forces. And of course, many imperialists have a lot of knowledge of doing this, a lot of experience of doing this. The British in particular used proxy forces in the main, for example, to conquer India. But more and more we see this pattern where in order to condition a population into becoming your proxy soldiers, you need to have an ideology that motivates them. Soldiers need to feel they're fighting for something. They need to feel motivated. And what the ruling class has found is when you can get a population which is poor and in some way angry and desperate, and feed them an ideology which makes them feel special and also tells them that another population is in the way of them achieving some dream or other that you've ideologically told them that, is their destiny. So you can see that that's how they made ISIS fighters, you can see how that's how they make Zionists, to fight in the Middle East. And that's exactly what they did with the people of West Ukraine, Ukrainian nationalism against Russians, or the people in the east of the country and against Russia, right? That you ideologically, shape a population which is basically poor and desperate, and give it a whole load of weapons. The shaping of the Ukrainian nationalists into fascists, of course, is a long running project for a small section of them, but to expand it out it was a big project, wasn't it? You can see phases of it. So you can see that during the Cold War there was a small number of Banderites who were like evacuated to the West and taken care of and funded so that they could retain their, what do they call them, their customs, i.e. practice and rehearse all of the Nazi ideology to which they had been, affiliated during World War II and the 1930s. So they take these people, they say, here you are, have a social club, have some funding, we'll take care of you. And it's a kind of just in case thing. Now, imperialism always does this just in case thing. For example, the CIA pays the Dalai Lama £200,000 a year, it's probably more by now, to live in India. Why? Just in case they get the chance to send him back to Tibet. They got him ready and waiting. So they were, they do this just in case funding in lots of places, and it doesn't always work out for them, but in this case it did, right? When the Soviet Union came down, immediately started parachuting some of these people back into Ukraine and began this slow and steady process of creating a hostile environment against Russians and a friendly environment towards Ukrainian nationalism, step by step, changing the customs and the culture of the country, first of all, by rewriting the country's history and then making that official. You know, they'd been doing that in Cold War kind of publications that not that many people paid attention to, you know, during the 70s, 80s. But then the 90s, the 2000s, they start making museums in Ukraine about people's history. And then they start writing new textbooks for Ukraine. You know, Ukraine didn't have one coup, it had two. Remember 2004, there was the coup. And there were fascists in the street then. And it became clear what this project is about. They want to turn Ukraine into a battering ram against Russia. And that means you've got to condition some of the people to be your soldiers. And that's exactly what we've seen, how they use, you know, fascist ideologies to condition poor people to be their proxy cannon fodder. Because the thing about imperialism is it doesn't give a hoot. It does not care one tiny bit for the ordinary people. It pretends to. It pretends to care about them. It says stand with Ukraine. But look how many people they are prepared to throw away in their desire to destroy Russia. They don't care if they kill every Ukrainian. To them, the Ukrainians are just pieces on their chessboard. They're entirely expendable. The entire Ukrainian nation is totally expendable as far as its Western sponsors are concerned. Their function is to try to somehow wear down the will of the Russian people, to somehow create some instability that will bring down the government of President Putin. You know, what they want is regime change in Russia so they can have a government that will facilitate them to recolonize Russia. That is what they want.
It's amazing that you understand our internal situation that way. It's amazing. And the next question is about the modern Trotskyists in the West. What are the key issues which divide the Western leftists? I can say that there are three such issues in our country. First, the attitude towards the dictatorship of proletariat and the allocation of the vanguard of the proletariat, you know, so who are the real proletarians? The second question is the understanding of imperialism, which we have already discussed. And the third question is the possibility of building socialism in a single country. In general, our Trotskyists joined the liberals and began to fully share their agenda, although they're still dressed in red clothes.
You know, I think that last bit you said there, Katerina, is really the key. They're liberals who dress in red clothes. You know, actually, increasingly, I'm of the opinion that even Trotsky himself was very likely an imperialist agent, and not even from later on, but from quite early. There's some evidence now that points to the possibility that he was already communicating with British state forces, British imperialist spy masters during World War I. That's during the revolutionary period. If you look at his activity, you look at his writing, what he was constantly doing was acting as a provocateur. And his theories don't have a coherent narrative, except that to be anti-Lenin and anti-Bolshevik, right? They don't, like everything he said, you know, that you can find contradictions and you can, you know, but what you find is at any particular moment, he's against Lenin, he's against the Bolsheviks, right? Doesn't matter what they're doing. So sometimes it's from one side, sometimes it's from another side. The consistency as being anti-Bolshevik and anti-Lenin. And that continues with the Trotskyites. You know, Trotskyism really, if it wasn't for the advent of Nikita Khrushchev to power in the Soviet Union, Trotskyism would have died a death after World War II because he was totally exposed. He spent the whole of World War II telling everybody that the Soviet Union is going to fall. He told everybody that Soviet Union had to fall, how awful it was. The Soviet Union won the war, defeated fascism, defied all of his predictions, built socialism. Even he himself had to recognize in other places, well, sometimes he was saying it's going to fall and it has to fall, and was working with German, Japanese, any imperialist power he could against the Soviet Union during the war. Then later on, you know, he also had to admit, you know, some of the great achievements of the planned economy that he said could never be built, right? You know, so he did contradict himself completely, and he would have died a nobody, to be honest with you, if it wasn't for the fact that when Khrushchev made his not so secret speech in 1956, he basically resurrected Trotskyism. All the lies he told in that speech were recycled from Trotsky. So immediately the Western intelligence agencies jump in and start giving massive generous funding to recreating revolutionary communist parties in the West based on Trotskyist ideology, because now even the Soviet Union says all these things which we were saying were true. If you grew up in the West, the history you were taught in school of the Russian Revolution is Trotsky's version of the Russian Revolution. And we are told that everything Trotsky said was true. Trotsky was the really great leader. Trotsky was the person who Lenin liked the best and who should have followed him. He was a real revolutionary. You know, they never explained to us why they're so concerned about the fate of the Russian Revolution, but it appears they were. They would have really, you know, it would have been much better for everybody if Trotsky had inherited the leadership after Lenin died, and Stalin was this awful, evil, baby-eating dictator, you know, who murdered 20 people before breakfast, you know, all the rest of it. So but we are given Trotskyite myths as fact in the West almost from birth when it comes to our understanding of socialism and the Soviet Union. And you know, Trotskyism plays this, and has played since the 1950s and especially 60s, 70s, 80s, a really important role in helping to fragment and destroy the communist movement. You know, Khrushchev's speech by itself is the most terrible thing that happened. I mean, obviously it went with him taking over control of the Soviet Union, or his clique and the people around him, the forces around him. But that speech and the policy of the Soviet Union that was connected to that speech, in the course of 1 year, half of the world's Communist Party members resigned. So it had this huge global impact. And into that place of demoralization and confusion and distress of so many people, like, we thought Stalin was this great hero, and now you're telling us that he was this awful guy, and we've been confused and misled, and maybe our rulers, when they tell us things about the Soviet Union, maybe they're telling the truth. And all this chaos, and every communist party split into factions between people upholding Stalin and people agreeing with Khrushchev. And, you know, this, all of this, into this situation came Trotskyite parties. So because Khrushchev's leading of the Soviet Union was preaching now peaceful coexistence with imperialism, the peaceful road to socialism, we don't want revolutions anymore. All the revisionist parties that stuck with Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, which was the biggest part of every big party, did that. They followed this line. They took it on and they put it out to their masses, and that totally demoralized the communist movement. So someone who believes, who reads Marx and Lenin and understands we need revolution, what happens to them when the Communist Party is now saying, oh, no, what we have to do is focus on getting social democrats elected to parliament, and we have to live peacefully, and there'll be a steady evolution to socialism, and, you know, anyway, there's nuclear weapons now, so we can't make a revolution because we'll all get killed, you know, and this demoralization. Well, so people who want revolution, now there were new organizations saying, no, this is not real socialism. If you want revolution, come to us. We're the real Leninists. And to prove that we're the real Leninists, we take on all of the words of the Bolshevik revolutionary period. So they always dress, you know, this is the Trotskyite movement now suddenly emerges as a pole of attraction for revolutionary minded young people. And they're using revolutionary words. They're saying one solution, revolution. You know, that's the solution to everything. They sound very, very militant. They sell newspapers on every corner, and they have names like, you know, Spartacist, and, you know, so they Red Hammer, and, you know, they take on all the imagery, the iconography, and the nomenclature. You know, the titles and the vocabulary of the Bolshevik Leninist, you know, revolutionary period. So they dress themselves up in these clothes. But what's the essence of their policy? You're right. They absolutely despise the dictatorship of the proletariat. They do not believe that the mass of the poor working class can be trusted with power. They denounce any development anywhere in the world where the mass of the poor working class are making history as some terrible putsch. They do not accept Lenin's thesis of imperialism. This is how you see that Trotskyism is really an imperialist ideology, because it essentially is rooted in the privileged sections of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie in the West. That's where it comes from. That's where it really rests naturally, particularly because since it doesn't recognize Lenin's thesis on imperialism, it doesn't recognize two really important things about the world. Number one is, in the West, the working class is divided because of imperialist super profits into a labor aristocracy, a privileged section, and a less privileged section. The Trotskyites say, no, 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 we're all workers, we're all the same. They won't recognize this difference, and therefore they can't act accordingly. They gloss it over and hide it, and actually they base themselves in the labor aristocracy, which is loyal to imperialism, right? That's number one. On the kind of flip side of that failure to understand what imperialism does, they don't recognize the national liberation struggles in the rest of the world as progressive. They denounce them on the basis that their leaderships are bourgeois, not proletarian. But of course, what that actually ends up meaning is, in both cases, they end up on the side of imperialism. So they reinforce imperialist propaganda about, for example, Irish liberation fighters. Oh no, they're bourgeois. It's a bourgeois nationalist movement. We can't have anything to do with that. So they make their objection sound very revolutionary. But the essence of their objection is to make them side with their own imperialist class. So this is the role that Trotskyism plays. It sucks up revolutionary-minded young people, keeps them busy for a while, doing nothing very meaningful, and reinforces the propaganda they've been given without helping them question and get rid of it, which is actually the job of a communist party. The job of a communist party is to re-educate young people or people who are coming towards the movement and help them get rid of the prejudices that their life, the media, the education system has filled their mind with. But of course, the Trotskyites have a much easier job. They just wrap up those prejudices in, revolutionary sounding phraseology. Last point you made about socialist construction. Yes, absolutely right. In every time the workers of the world actually get on, take power and start building something, the Trotskyists can be absolutely relied upon to denounce it. But on the other side, they're always seeing socialist projects where they don't exist. For example, I'll give you some examples. In the anti-war movement that I've been active in Britain for many, many years, in fact, decades, every single time British imperialism was planning to join American imperialism in launching a war against some country in the Middle East, the Trotskyites would turn up at anti-war meetings all around the country and start saying how the targeted country was having a popular revolution and that there were people's councils being formed. So they make it sound like there's something very socialist and Bolshevik going on. So they said it about Syria, they said it about Iran, they said it about Libya. They may have said about Yugoslavia. I can't remember all the way back that far. But, they regularly say it. And they never afterwards admit that that was a total lie. It's always a total lie, right? But they propagate this idea. Presumably most of their people don't realize this is a lie. They feel excited because they're told it's true and they go to meetings and say it. But these are essentially, the security services lies to brainwash progressive workers into feeling that the war aims of the imperialists are justified. We're going in to help get rid of a Nazi dictator, and at the same time the people are rising up against the same dictator, right? So in the anti-war movement, the Trotskyites come along reinforcing the imperialist pro-war propaganda with a left kind of slogan onto it.
Our leftists also say that there is the imperialist dictatorship here in Russia, or our local dictatorship. So if we lose the war, just Americans will come and will rule us, and it wouldn't be worse than it is now.
That will be the same thing. What shocks me about that is, do they not remember what happened in the 1990s in the time of Boris Yeltsin? If you want to see a taste of what colonized Russia would be, look at what was happening then. Or look at what's happening in Ukraine. You don't have to look very far, do you, to see what happens to a total colony? Like, yes, okay, Russia is capitalist. And, you know, I understand this emotional anger and hatred for the capitalist class in Russia who have taken away, who have appropriated the wealth produced by the Soviet people and taken away the socialist system built by the Soviet people. But we have to study and remain objective in our analysis, or we become people who can be manipulated because we're acting emotionally, not on the basis of socialist science. Socialist science is not a group of insults. You know, this is what the Trotskyites do. And the imperialists, in their propaganda, they encourage this. Everything should be emotional, and socialist terminology becomes swear words. You're an imperialist. No, you're an imperialist. You know, you're a Trotskyist. No, you're a... No, there must be meaning. There must be meaning to these words. You know, to say that there will be no difference is really a terrible thing to say to the Russian people, because you are helping the imperialists to demoralize the people. You're helping to demotivate them and to demobilize them when everything is needed right now to the war effort to defeat imperialism. And Russia is not just fighting for Russia. Russia is fighting for the world. Russia's doing an amazing job. But it's a very difficult and important fight that Russia's engaged on. We need to mobilize anybody who wants to see the end of imperialism has to understand that this existential fight of Russia's is a key battle in the defeat of US imperialism, which is the mainstay of the world imperialist system right now. You know, the European imperialist powers are nothing without the US's military might anymore. And so the whole imperialist system is hinging on the US's ability to remain hegemonic in the world. Mm-hmm. And this fight, you know, why can they not walk away from it, even though they've clearly been beaten, and that was clear from quite early on? They can't walk away from it because it's such a big defeat for them. The prospects of looting Russia, which they need, the imperialists need to have a big loot fest soon, or their economy is going to collapse completely. This, like, you have to study imperialism and imperialist economics and see these developments objectively, or you'll end up giving, you know, even though you want the best for your country and your people, you're going to end up giving them the opposite message from the one that they need. Now, Russia is in a situation as an anti-imperialist but capitalist country where communists need to make common cause with the national bourgeoisie against imperialism, recognizing that that's an unstable alliance. It's not a promise forever. It's not an assumption that Vladimir Putin is going to bring back the Soviet Union. But let's also admit to ourselves, you know, that history is a contradictory process. The truth is, in having to face imperialism, the government of Vladimir Putin and National Russia is having to deliver things to the Russian people. It's also having to develop its economy in a self-sufficient way, which is very beneficial to Russia. And in many ways, it's having to resuscitate a whole load of Soviet traditions in order to stand up to imperialism. So whether it wants to or not, objectively, it's doing things which help lay the groundwork for bringing back the Soviet Union. That might not be its plan. That's our plan, right? But, you know, we have to objectively see that these things are the outcome of this fight against imperialism. And to me, you know, good revolutionary communists need to find a way to be at the heart of this process, to mobilize the people that actually defeating imperialism isn't going to be enough. If we don't want to, you know, suffer all the same fates again and again, we're going to have to not just defeat imperialism, but reinstate the Soviet Union. We need to go back to a socialist planned economy in order to be strong, secure, peaceful, educated, cultured, you know all the things you lost, right?
Live our best life, right?
To live your best life.
I also wanted to ask you about the organization in which you belong to, the International Anti-Imperialist Platform. Where can we read some program articles, some publications about the organization's activities? And just tell a little bit about the organization.
So, in fact, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform was formed after the launch of Russia's special military operation. And it was really a response to the utter theoretical confusion in the communist movement globally in the wake of that operation being launched, because it was shocking to discover just how many parties calling themselves socialist and communist were denouncing Russia, including in my own country. The Communist Party of Britain, so-called, the revisionist party, its position is a kind of sitting on the fence, pretending to kind of see both sides are bad and we just want peace. Oh, there needs to be a peace plan, there needs to be a peace plan. But in fact, the first line of their demands for this peace are Russian troops out. But of course, Russian troops out means NATO troops in. And there's no recognition of that. It means carry on with your, attempted genocide in the Donbass. Russian troops out. It means essentially it's agreeing with the imperialists that all this situation came about because Russia was randomly aggressive one day. Vladimir Putin woke up one day and decided to launch an unjustified aggression against Ukraine.
Just crazy.
Yeah, so many parties around the world were repeating this, which is essentially imperialist propaganda. So what that shows us is that a lot of people who call themselves communist are not studying properly, not following developments properly. We had 8 years to prepare for what was happening with the SMO. My party has produced a book on the war in Ukraine, which puts together the articles we were writing from 2014 onwards. Like, it was clear to people who are communist and Marxist what was happening from then. It shouldn't have been a shock to them that the SMO ended up being launched. I mean, it might have been a surprise in the moment, but only for a very, only momentarily. In terms of understanding the context and what had driven it, there was nothing surprising. It was all there in front of us. The Minsk and, the way that NATO was building up Ukraine, all the rest of it, and fortifying it, all these things. And certainly, since the launch of the war, very quickly after the start of the SMO, we got a lot more information about just how militarized Ukraine had become, how fortified the country had become. And there's only one reason for all that fortification. That's because you're planning a war against Russia. No other reason. But so the World Anti-Imperialist platform was basically, some communist groups got together and said, look, there's a real problem in our movement. People are spreading lies about and repeating imperialist propaganda about Russia, and they are demobilizing the world's working class and progressive sections of working people who should be very clear that they have a side in the war. All of progressive humanity should be on the side of Russia, should want the defeat of the fascist proxy forces in Ukraine, which is basically a front for NATO. It's a proxy war waged by NATO against Russia. The territory is Ukraine. The cannon fodder is Ukrainian. But the war is launched by NATO to destroy Russia. And we need to understand that. And the fact that so few communist parties are able to articulate that, we thought is a real problem. So essentially, we founded the platform. We wrote something called the Paris Declaration. And if you search the internet for the Paris Declaration, World Anti-Imperialist Platform, you can probably find it. We do have a website, I think it's platform21.org, where you can find our kind of founding documents. And, since our founding conference, which was in October 2 years ago in Paris, where we launched the Paris Declaration with a fairly small number of parties initially signing it, we have made big efforts to connect with parties from around the world, to hold conferences in different parts of the world, to bring communists together on an anti-imperialist platform, which means exposing the wrong and rotten theories about imperialism, which are confusing to many people who identify as communists, but haven't really got a strong theoretical foundation to be able to make sense of what's happening.
And now I have the last question. How life changed in Britain since 2020? Just has the standard of living changed, like public opinion, something?
Yes, everything is changing quite fast these days, actually. There was already an economic crisis in Britain that's been ongoing and in many ways getting steadily worse since 2008. Austerity for the working class, cuts in government spending, cuts in wages, pay, pensions have been steadily getting worse and worse since 2008. 2020, there was another big stock market crash, and it was covered up by the COVID lockdowns. So a lot of people didn't realize it happened. But actually, under the cover of paying people, paying to help people get through COVID, actually what the government did was print a lot of money to pay companies that were failing on the stock exchange. So we had a big bailout of the stock exchange in 2020. We had a lot of money printing during the period of COVID to pay big pharmaceutical companies and various providers and big tech companies. And, you know, so there was some parts of the economy making a huge amount of money while many small companies were going out of business. And since then, of course, with Russia's launch of the SMO, then Britain massively ramped up its funding to the Ukrainian army. And that has also been done through money printing, and of course, all this money printing is devaluing our currency and creating inflation. And then on top of that, so we already had an inflation crisis. That has come back from 2008, that the government bailed out the banks which were failing in 2008 by printing a huge amount of money. And because they didn't get the repercussions of that immediately, they started to believe that they could just keep printing money forever and it will have no consequence. And the imperialists can also get away with this for a while because they have currencies which the whole world has to use. So there's many pounds in circulation, many dollars especially in circulation. So it takes a long time for your money printing to start to devalue the currency. But eventually it does, right? Eventually you're getting, and you've made a situation where inflation is now rampant and out of control and they can't get a handle back on it. On top of this, the all-out economic war they waged against Russia at the beginning of the SMO and since then in the last 2 years has massively exacerbated our problem because it cut off the supplies of cheap Russian energy to Western Europe. And that has given us both inflation in the cost of all our goods, inflation in the cost of all our transport, and of course, further inflation because there's an energy shortage. And all of that means that we have an energy crisis. The price of energy in Britain in the last few years has gone up absolutely astronomically. And the price of goods is rising fast all the time. So the standard of living, and particularly for the poorest sections of the country, are plummeting very fast. And every winter now in the papers, there's a discussion. How are people going to get through the winter? You know, what's going to happen if there's a cold snap? Like, this is now becoming a thing we all have to worry about. If there's a sudden, you know, a big chunk of time where it gets really cold and people need a lot of heating, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the poor in that situation? In our country, you know, we're the 6th richest or 7th richest country in the world, they tell us. And yet, something like 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 British children goes to school hungry and comes home to a cold house. So this is not something that I saw in the Britain that I grew up in. This is a very modern phenomenon. We are returning to the times before World War II, as the social safety net is gradually being got rid of. And the reason for it is the economic crisis, which means that areas of profitability are being sought very desperately by the imperialists. They've got all this money to invest. They need to invest and make a profit. And so any part of the economy that's not making profits for them, they need to get hold of and make profits. So all of our public utilities, all of our public services are privatized to become businesses and make profits. And what that means is a worse service that's very expensive for workers, and increasingly, you know, no service or just, you know, very little for paying a lot. And all of this adds up to, you know, a situation where our schools are in crisis, our hospitals and GP, you know, doctor surgeries are in crisis, our roads don't get mended, you know, we don't have decent, you know, we can't afford enough food, enough heating, you know, masses of workers simply just can't really afford their lives. Their working hours get longer and longer. People are more and more stressed. So this is very much the direction of travel we see. And now we have a new Labour government, which came in making 1 or 2 promises to make things a bit better. Immediately it got into office, it said, we fully back NATO, we fully back Ukraine to the last Ukrainian, you know, we stand with Ukraine forever. And then they said, oh, we've just discovered that there's a big hole in the finances that we didn't know about. So those things we said we'd do for the poor, we can't do them. So there were certain things they were going to do, like scrap a rule in benefits, which means that poor families that have more than 2 children can only get benefits as if they had 2 children. So what that does is just force the poorest people in our society into really abject poverty, and it's children that they're forcing into poverty with this measure, right? They're punishing them because their parents had too many children and not enough money, right? So they scrapped that. They said they were going to get away with it. Before they're elected, they said it's an inhuman measure, but then they came in and said, oh, well, we've got to balance the books, so sorry about that. And they've introduced means testing. So because of the kind of outrage about the cost of fuel for poor people, for the last few winters, there's been something called a winter fuel allowance for the elderly, for old people. A winter fuel allowance to help them get through the winter and not die of the cold, you know, in the winter time. Now they've introduced a means test. So you have to prove that you're poor enough to get the money. And of course, what that means is there will be a section of the poor elderly who don't quite qualify, or who don't even try and fill the form in, but who are too poor to heat their houses. You know, so again, there'll be a section of poor people who are penalised by this measure. So you know, the things that they're doing as soon as they've arrived into office are push down on the poor, more money to the arms manufacturers, more support for NATO, you know, into the drive to war even more, you know, public statements about how China is the most important enemy, Russia's got to be defeated, China's got to be defeated, you know, they want to defeat everything that stands in the way of imperialist looting of the planet. And this is supposed to be a Labour government, right? The party of the working class is still described as, by the Trotskyists, by the revisionists, they still call the Labour Party the party of the working class, although, you know, it spent 100 years as a servant of imperialism.
And what about the public opinion? What people think about all this?
You know, there's a lot of anger and frustration about, you know, the rapidly falling living standards for many people. There's also a lot of confusion about where it comes from. Unfortunately, people don't really follow and pay a lot of attention to the war in Ukraine. They don't tend to understand its significance, or the fact that they're being completely lied to about it. There's a lot of lies told to them about immigration, that the reason that they're poor and that they don't have jobs and that their services are crumbling is because of immigrants, which of course it is not. It's because of capitalism and imperialism. But one thing I think where public opinion is causing real problems for the ruling class is when it comes to the genocide in Gaza. Now that is something which a large section of the British working class is paying very close attention to. And they are disgusted by the complicity of every one of our political parties, of all of the main media outlets. It's been totally exposed to them that the media and the politicians lie, and they know they're lying, and that they're defending fascists, they're defending genocide, they're apologising for it, covering it up for it, arming it, funding it. So this is something which is creating a real tension and a real problem for the ruling class. And another set of measures that has been announced by our government is to do with trying to crush this dissent. So they used the excuse of racist riots that we had in the summer. And actually those riots were stirred up by the very people who then come up and say, oh, how shocking, how disgusting, we must get rid of horrible racists, right? So they stir it up and then they use it as an excuse to say, oh, our laws aren't good enough. If only we had different laws, we wouldn't have these awful racists on the streets trying to murder refugees. That's not true. It's already a crime to try to murder refugees. It's already a crime to try to burn down buildings. You know, it's all those things are already crimes, right? But they're saying, oh, because we need to crack down on this terrible behaviour, what do we want to do? We want to speed up the judicial process. What will that mean? That means there's no time to prepare a defence. So that's the abolition of, they're proposing essentially the abolition of due process. They say we have to crack down on hate speech. You know, people in my party were arrested on the Palestine demonstrations for hate speech. We were told it was anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist, and our party members were arrested for hate speech, but they weren't able to bring a prosecution because we have all the arguments and they wouldn't be able to get a conviction. So they want to make the laws against hate speech stronger, not to stop racism, which they provoke all the time, to stop anti-Zionist, which is anti-imperialist speech. They want to stop that speech very much, and they're trying to find ways to do it. There recently was an arrest of a middle-aged lady who just lives quietly in a village in rural England, but who spends a lot of time collating information about Palestine and posting it on the internet. She's not particularly well known. She's not in an organization. She doesn't have a party behind her. She was targeted for the most brutal arrest and an anti-terror raid. It was really horrific what they did to her, what they did to her house. Very, very brutal. It's time to send a message to people, you know, to say hate speech, posting things online can open you up to this type of attack, you know, to scare people off, because there's a growing number of people who are paying attention and who feel really like they have to do something. So they want to crack down on speech. They want to have more censorship, and they want to crack down on the right to protest also. The most recent Palestine demonstration, there were moves by the police to try to disrupt that, stop it from happening, stop it from taking the usual route, stop it, you know, even though they're very respectable, peaceful demonstrations, they've started this process of trying to disrupt it and trying to present, you know, when the riots happened in the summer, a lot of the media and politicians referred to them as protests. So they want to conflate protest and rioting. They want to conflate anti-Zionism with racism so that they can justify keeping it off the streets, because the Palestine movement is something very, very worrying to them. You know, it's a big upsurge in popular anger, and at the heart of it, it's anti-imperialist, because the real message of it is imperialism out of the Middle East. And of course, the Middle East is a key asset of Anglo-American imperialism, and without it, they're really in trouble.
Aren't you scared to say all these things on YouTube or somewhere?
Well, you know, whatever happens, happens. You know, you don't become a revolutionary to live a quiet and easy life. So far, we have been too small to be serious targets of the state. At the point at which that changes, you know, we'll have to find other ways. But, you know, the reality is we have to tell people the truth. You know, that's the job of the revolutionaries. And if we ultimately, the working class has all the power, it just doesn't realize it, you know. But how do you help them realize it? If you too are scared of what the ruling class might do to you if you say something, well, then who are the people who are going to help the working class to understand that Marxism has the key to the problems that face them, that they have the power themselves to change society, that their force is far stronger even than all the forces of this apparently very strong, powerful state? Because this strong, powerful state actually only benefits a tiny handful of people. And even with all its proxy forces lined up in front of it, it's still a small minority of society. But we have to understand that, don't we? And the role of the vanguard is to instill this consciousness into the masses and take away their fear, take away their isolation, bring back to them a sense of class solidarity. So, you know, this is our job. We you know, whatever happens, that's what we have to do.
Thank you very much, Joti. I'm really very happy to talk to you. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was nice meeting you. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.